destroy, but to fulfill. For it says, assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law until all is fulfilled. Therefore, whosoever shall break one of these least commandments and shall teach men to do so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But he who does and teaches them shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. And so Jesus enters into this particular discussion talking about his relationship with the law of Moses. And we talked a little bit about this a couple of weeks ago in our Bible class, that if all of the law has been fulfilled, and the Bible teaches us that it has. I mean, no, the Bible, the New Testament could not speak of the end of the Old Covenant until it's all fulfilled, right? In other words, you take a statement that Jesus made. Until heaven and earth pass away, not one jot, that's the smallest stroke, not one tittle, the smallest crossing, dotting an I, the very smallest marks of the smallest letter of the old law. None of that will be done away with until all is fulfilled. And then if we read elsewhere in our New Testament later on, where the Bible says over and over and over again that the Old Testament is done away with, then we also know that it's all been fulfilled. And I made the note that I got to thinking about something that made my head hurt. But I thought it was an interesting idea, and that is that if all of the Old Testament has been fulfilled, then one cannot go to the Old Testament and talk about future events that are associated with the error known as premillennialism. Because the premillennialist is they're going to run to Daniel, they're going to run to Ezekiel, they're going to run to Zephaniah or Zechariah, and they're going to talk about all these Old Testament passages in such a way as to speak of them as if they are describing something that for us is still in the future. But that won't work, will it? Because Jesus not only talked about the law in this text, he says, not one jot or tittle will pass away until all of it's fulfilled, the law and the prophets. And so it is a mistake. It is a mistake to refer to any Old Testament passage as speaking of any event that is yet in the future. It's kind of like you're putting two things together. Jesus said, this will not happen until this takes place. And then in another place, it just says, this has taken place. So then you can put the two together and realize what the status is. And it's like a lot of times we talk about the destruction of Jerusalem in Matthew 24. Jesus said in Matthew 24:14, he says, the gospel of the kingdom has to be preached to the whole world, and then the end will come. That end he's talking about is the destruction of Jerusalem. All right? Well, did the destruction of Jerusalem take place? It did. Does the Bible in other places state clearly that the gospel was preached to the whole world? It does. For example, Paul wrote in Colossians 1:6, Colossians 1:23, Romans 10:16-18. Paul wrote in the years ahead of the destruction of Jerusalem that the gospel had been preached to the whole world. But we wouldn't even have to have those statements to know that the gospel had been preached to the whole world, because Jesus said, when this happens, this will happen. And when that happens, you know that the precursor happened. Now, you wouldn't need any statement to the effect that the gospel was preached to the whole world to know that it was preached to the whole world, because Jerusalem was destroyed. And Jesus told what the conditions were. But we do have those statements. Multiple statements that the gospel was preached to the whole world. And that's why I'm talking about these things. Putting these things together. Drawing reasonable and logical and, in my opinion, irrefutable conclusions. I mean, I just don't, there's no way, I don't see how there's any way to get around either one of those things. And so but that's just some things I was thinking about with regard to verses 17 and 18. And now in verses 19 and 20, we closed 2 weeks ago talking about the matter of except your righteousness exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. And I made mention that for a long time in my ministry, I used that verse to talk about giving. Because the Pharisees were, they were obsessively compelled to tithe. Even Jesus recognized this in them. You tithe mint and anise and cumin. In other words, the smallest of spices. In other words, you're good tithers. You tithe everything, all that you have, you tithe it all the way down. All the way down that if somebody gave you a pound of salt, you'd turn around and tithe a pound of salt. It says, but you've omitted the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy. And he says, these things you ought to have done and not left the others undone. So he wasn't condemning them for what they were doing. He's saying, you've majored in minors, and you've omitted the majors. And so with that in mind, thinking about how I used to teach it, that if the Pharisees were obsessive about tithing and giving 10%, then our righteousness has to exceed their righteousness. But the problem with that application is, and the reason I don't use that anymore, is Jesus was not talking about their righteousness in regard to their tithing or their giving. He was talking about their attitude. And he was talking about the things they had omitted as opposed to the things that they had paid very close attention to. And so the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees was an outward righteousness. And by the way, we'll see that, if we were just going to read through the Sermon on the Mount, we're going to see that at the very beginning of chapter 6. The first 14 verses, the first 16 verses of Matthew chapter 6 is a discussion of the outward righteousness of the Pharisees. They loved to do their charity work in full view. Look, if they had cell phones in the first century, the Pharisees would took a selfie of themselves every time they stepped into a bread line, right? Got $100 bill. Here's a bum on the street, and the Pharisee's going to hand him $100 bill. Get his selfie made so that everybody can see him. See how righteous he is, how generous he is. Or then secondly, how they wanted to pray standing up in the synagogue or standing on the street corner, so everybody could see how righteous they are. And then at the end of that text, fasting. They would disfigure their faces. They'd get out of bed and wouldn't comb their hair. And they'd walk around with a sad countenance so that somebody would ask them, man, what's wrong with you today? Oh, man, I'm fasting today. See, that's outward righteousness. And Jesus said what? With the matter of charity, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. In the matter of prayer, go into your closet. And in the matter of fasting, wash your face and comb your hair. Wash your face and comb your hair. And so Jesus is in this discussion of the Pharisees' righteousness, which has to do with the shallowness and the externals. But on the inside, Jesus said they're like whitewashed sepulchres. A tombstone. On the outside, it's beautiful, but on the inside, what? Full of dead men's bones. It reminds me, again, I'm not against decorations, but it reminds me of after a decoration weekend. A cemetery looks beautiful, doesn't it? All the grass is mowed and the trim work's done around the stones, and there's flowers everywhere. And man, it looks beautiful, right? Almost like a garden. But what's it full of? It's full of dead men's bones. And Jesus said the Pharisees were like that. They're beautiful on the outside. They can make it real pretty on the outside. But on the inside, just full of extortion, wickedness, all types of corruption. And so that's what Jesus is getting at here, is that he wants our righteousness to be a true righteousness. He wants it to be a genuine righteousness. He wants it to be a righteousness that, that isn't from the outside. It's not on the outside, but it's on the inside and then works its way to the outside. Again, not so that people can see, but if we start on the inside and do the things that are right, people will naturally see. I've used this as an example before, and I don't even know the guy's name. My brother-in-law and I were playing golf one day up at Palmy Creek in Arnold, and we were playing by ourselves, and there was another guy, and he was playing by himself, just a single, and he said, "Do you mind if I play with you guys?" I said, "Oh man, come on, play. More the merrier." So we're playing, and we're all about the same. We're not very good. All right, we're spraying them off in the ditch and in the woods, and hitting them about 10 feet. They roll about 10 feet. Not all the time, but you know what I'm saying. We're going to hit some bad shots. All right, but now remember, we're in St. Louis now. We're in St. Louis, not exactly the buckle of the Bible Belt. All right, and so most of the time when you play golf with guys that hit it like that, you're going to hear a lot of cursing. That guy never said one curse word the whole 18 holes we played with. Of course, Dave and I, don't curse, but we got to the end of the round. I said, "Dave, did you notice something about that guy?" He says, "What?" I said, "Never cursed a single time." In other words, he didn't have to tell us that he was mindful of his language, because we knew what kind of people we would normally find in that situation and what we would normally hear in that type of situation, and we didn't hear those things. Dave's like, "Yeah, you're right." So in other words, our righteousness will be. We don't have to tell people. We don't have to point to it. If we just live the Christian life, we'll be different enough from the world and even the religious world enough to know that people will know that we are different. And so that's the righteousness that is under consideration here in this text. Now I want to do this because this is a great text. I want us to go to Galatians 4:21 to 31, just very quickly, because this is a text I know we studied. Well, I say we studied this. I think I wrote some class material on Galatians about 20 years ago. So it's been a while. It's been a while since we studied Galatians. So I know I wrote about this text, but 20 years ago, most of you weren't here. So I think at least bears a look about the law, about Jesus and his relationship to the law. Now, the book of Galatians is written. Now, the first two chapters deal with personal matters about Paul and the gospel, about Paul and his former life, about Paul and Peter. But then you get to chapter 3, and Paul begins with, "O foolish Galatians." And he's talking to them about their desire to go back to the law of Moses, which is also the whole purpose of writing the book. Whoever it is that wrote Hebrews wrote that book for the same reason. This was a problem for the Jews. Going back to the old law was a problem for them. And so Paul begins in chapter 3 to talk to them about, did you receive the Spirit by the works of the law or by the hearing of faith? In other words, all these good things that have happened to you, did those things happen to you when you were still under the law? Or did they happen to you after you became Christians? You see. And so he gets down to chapter 4 and verse 21, and he says, "Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons." I'm in verse 22 of chapter 4. "One by a bondwoman, the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, and he of the free woman through promise. Which things are symbolic?" In other words, God used this incident in the life of Abraham to show a spiritual truth. In other words, I'm not saying God caused these things to happen. God didn't cause Abraham to basically give up on his promise and have a child through Hagar. But God knew those things were going to happen. And God knew how he was going to use those things to the teaching of the Jewish people later on. He says, these things are symbolic. These are the two covenants. The one from Mount Sinai, which gives birth to bondage, which is Hagar. In other words, the first son that he had is born according to the flesh. And this is represented by Hagar. And this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. Well, that's where the law came from, you see. The law came from Mount Sinai. So Hagar and her son are representatives of the old law that was given at Sinai. It says, and it corresponds to Jerusalem, which now is, and is in bondage with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, which is the mother of us all. For it is written, rejoice, O barren, you who do not bear, break forth and shout, you who are not in labor, for the desolate has many more children than she who has a husband. Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are children of promise. But as he who was born according to the flesh then persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, even so it is now. Nevertheless, what does the Scripture say? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. Note what he says here in verse 29. That Hagar and Ishmael, who was born to Hagar, was a persecutor of the children of Isaac. And Paul says, and it's the same right now. It's the same right now. In other words, you're Christians, but what he's saying is this: you're Christians and you're being persecuted by the Jews. That's what he's saying. That's it, what he means by even so it is now. That Hagar and Ishmael are represented in the Jews, and you're represented in Sarah and Isaac, and these are now persecuting you, even though you used to be one of these. And so he's showing the symbolism of how God worked through these events to bring them to where they were at that point in time. And then note verse 30 says, cast out the bondwoman and her son. You know, there were two occasions where Hagar was kicked out. All right. After Isaac was conceived, Hagar and Ishmael were mocking her. I mean, it is kind of interesting to think about a 90-year-old woman walking around with a baby bump. All right? And so they were mocking her. And Sarah, which is interesting because Sarah was still the boss. And she said, kick him out. Send him out. And Abraham was not happy, but he did what she said. So they go out. Then God appears to her and her boy, and he says, go back and submit yourself to her. Go back and be submissive, because she was her handmaiden. But she thought just because she'd had a kid by Abraham, she was better than Sarah, which wasn't true. Go back and submit yourself to her. Well, then when it came time for basically we might say Isaac's presentation after he was born, then mocking again, and Sarah says they got to go. They got to go. And then the second time they got kicked out, God didn't send them back, but he did take care of them. And he said, out of your son will be 12 princes, be a great nation. And that was indeed the case. Unfortunately, those people are modern day Muslims. And by the way, God said a long, long time ago that the children of Ishmael wouldn't be able to get along with anybody. They'd be irrational. You couldn't be peaceable with them. Their hand will be against every man, and every man's hand will be against them. That's still true today. God said that 4,000 years ago, and it's still true today. You can't get along with the Muslims. Their book says you can't get along with them. Look, they can whitewash that thing any way they want to whitewash it. It still says what it says. It still commands them to dominate and kill infidels. And anybody that's not a Muslim is an infidel. Look, don't let nobody fool you. By the way, let me just say this as somewhat of a caveat. I'm not saying all Muslims are bad people. All right? I mean, I know some Muslim people, and they're, the ones that I know are pretty good people. Right? But you can't judge the Muslims that you know in America against the ones that are living over in the Middle East. They ain't the same. They ain't the same. And given enough leeway, the ones in America will act like the ones in the Middle East. Now you go up into Michigan where there's huge population of Muslims in various areas. You don't go there. That's right. You don't go there. And so God said 4,000 years ago the descendants of Ishmael wouldn't be able to get along with anybody. And that's still true today, and it'll always be true. It'll always be true. And so you're looking on the second page here of Lesson Plan 23. It contrasts Hagar and Ishmael with Sarah and Isaac. In letter C, they're there. It says, in letter C, it represents the covenant law, the law of Moses. On the right-hand side, the other represents the new covenant, the new law. The other is Mount Sinai. The law originated there, but the new covenant originated in Jerusalem, as in keeping with Isaiah 2 and 3, Daniel chapter 2, Micah chapter 4. And so these, the source of the new law was going to be in Jerusalem, not in Mount Sinai. Letter E, one accords to bondage, while the other accords to freedom. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ has made us free, and do not be entangled again in the yoke of bondage. Galatians 5 and verse 1. The old law is always associated with bondage, especially in regard to its relationship to sin and its relationship to the freedom that we have in Christ. So you have bondage and freedom. Hagar and Ishmael, not promised. Sarah and Isaac, promised. And by the way, the text talks about that one was born according to the flesh. What does that mean? It means that Ishmael was born just like every other human being's been born. What? It wasn't a promise of God. God promised a son to Abraham through Sarah. He didn't look. If he'd have just promised him a son in general, then Ishmael might have worked, right? But if he promised him a son by Sarah, Ishmael's not the answer. You see? And so you have that Ishmael was not the son of promise, but Isaac is the son of promise. And we who are Christians are affiliated with the son of promise and not with the son of bondage. And so then at the bottom half here speaks about Colossians 2:14, Hebrews 8:6 and 7 talks about explicitly how the old law has been taken away. The old law has been taken away, being nailed to the cross. Hebrews 8 and verse 6, if the first covenant had been faultless, no place would have been sought for the second. Then the first one is spoken of in the last verse of Hebrews 8 and verse 13. It's waxing old and ready to fade away. And we've talked about this a number of times through the years, how as the gospel increased in its scope and how it was being preached, the old law was decreasing by the exact same amount. And then once the gospel was preached to every creature under heaven, the old law and the patriarchal law were both done away with. Both done away with completely. And then at that point in time, the gospel was the only law for all men everywhere for all time. And so the scriptures are clear with regard to the abrogation of the old law. All right, let's go to the last page here on lesson plan 23. Again, describe, I think we ran through these a couple weeks ago, maybe I can't recall. Describe Jesus' relationship to the law. All right, he was the lawgiver. I mean, Moses is called the lawgiver, but we know it was given to him. Yeah, right. Yeah, by the Lord. What else? What about his relationship to the law? There you go. He followed it, and he followed it how? Every bit of it perfectly. And then also, I would add this. He not only followed it, he agreed with it. In other words, all the punishments in the book of Leviticus, all of the capital punishments, there's like 20 sins in Leviticus 17 through 20, and maybe more than 20. More than 20 sins punishable by death under the old law. And Jesus agreed with all of them. He not only lived under them, he agreed with them. A lot of times we live under laws and we obey them even if we don't agree with them, right? But Jesus, being the lawgiver, lived under that same law that he gave, and he agreed. He agreed with the entirety of it. He affirmed it. And then came the fulfilling of it. That's right. That's another part of his relationship with the law. He was the only one that could fulfill it. And so there's Jesus' relationship with the law. Go ahead, Sean. Yeah, done away with it. That's right. The fulfillment of it makes it. Yeah, the fulfillment of it does away with it.
Put it in process.
Right. It's like when I used as an example when my folks wrote another will and Paul and I didn't know about it. And we thought the will that we had in our possession was the latest will, and it wasn't the latest will. And the newest will was very close to the one we had, but it wasn't the same. And so the one that was written last is the one that counts, right? And so it is with the old law and the new law. That's Hebrews 8. It's a covenant. It's talking about a covenant where, as a will says, where there is a will, there has to be the death of the one who made the will, right? As long as my parents are living, they can write another will, right? And they can keep on making wills, right? But when they die, the last one that got written is in effect. That's right. The last one written is in effect, and nobody can change it. You can't annul it. I guess Scott would tell you could fight it in court, but the way it's supposed to work is that the last will is the one that is in effect, no matter how many there were before it. And so, when the Bible speaks about the death of the one who made it, we know that the new law came into effect at the death of Jesus, and it did away with every other will that God had ever made with man, either through the patriarchy or through the law of Moses. Let me look at number 3 real quick. The Old Testament was a covenant between God and who? The Jews. And really that should say the Old Covenant, because the Old Testament is not accurate. To say the Old Testament is not accurate, because God also was telling the Gentiles how to live, even though the Jews had one set of laws, and the Jews had one set of laws, and the Gentiles had another set of laws. All right, and part of that Old Testament, now catch my words now. Part of the Old Testament deals with God's relationship with Gentiles. For example, the whole book of Jonah. The Ninevites were not Jews, and yet they were not living the way God wanted them to live, so he sent Jonah to Nineveh to tell them, yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be overthrown. And they repented. In other words, they corrected their relationship with the God of heaven. God expected them to do that. The book of Amos is condemnation on about contains condemnation of about 7 Gentile nations. Why would Amos pronounce a condemnation or a woe on a Gentile nation if that Gentile nation was not under some obligation to the God of heaven? And so that's why I want to make sure we understand. The Old Testament is not just about the Jews. Some of it is about the Gentiles. So the more accurate, I think the more accurate way to say that is that the law of Moses was a covenant between God and who? The Jews. And only the Jews. Deuteronomy 5, 1-5. Moses reaffirmed that right before he died. It says, God made this covenant with us at Horeb, even all of us who are alive here this day. He did not make this covenant with our fathers, but with us. In other words, Abraham never lived under the 10 Commandments. None of those guys, nobody in the book of Genesis ever lived under the 10 Commandments. None of them. All right, and so this law was made specifically to and for the Jews. And so, this idea today of all these people trying to live under the law of Moses, trying to talk about living by the 10 Commandments. 10 Commandments never were given to them in the first place. Never were given to them in the first place because they're not Jews. All right. How did Jesus fulfill the law? He lived perfectly. He lived perfectly under that law. And then and died and gave us the new law. Obviously, number 5, is the law still binding on God's people? No. When Jesus preached this sermon, was the law still in force? Yes, it was. Yes, it was. And that's when we're going to start in verse 21. We'll start in verse 21 in lesson plan 24 next week with about I think there's about 7 you have heard it said statements in chapter 5. And Jesus is preparing people for the change of the law in this sermon. The law doesn't change just because Jesus said it at this point, because we said in order for a covenant to come into effect, what has to happen? Death. There has to be a death. That's right. And so Jesus is making his covenant beginning with this Sermon on the Mount and his other teachings, but it doesn't come into effect until after he dies. All right, we'll start lesson plan 24, Lord willing, next week. Is that August 6th?